All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out nice and early to get started today. My talk, I'm going to talk about kind of an old-fashioned idea that tool making may have actually influenced the evolution of the human brain and cognition. This is what they used to call, back in the day, man the tool maker, right? There was a lot of kind of pushback, I think, in the last decades of the 20th century against this idea, emphasizing instead the challenges of social living and the so-called social brain, which still has, I guess, a lot of currency in popular culture today, maybe because we're also fascinated by Facebook and Twitter and that kind of thing. But I think what we're seeing at this colloquium is a recognition that trying to dichotomize between social and ecological intelligence it's really a false dichotomy due to the underlying importance of social learning across domains and what we're calling culture. So as an archaeologist, I try to take this insight on board by focusing not on the tools themselves, but on the learned skills that allow people to make and mobilize these tools effectively. So a much shorter title for this talk would have been Homo Artifex, from the Latin for skill and craftsmanship. Actually, another meaning of this also has to do with cunning and deception, as in artifice. So maybe the Machiavellian intelligence people can still be a little bit happy with it. So let's start with some really basic evolutionary framing, evolutionary background, and that is the fact that humans are really successful primates, paradoxically successful when you consider that we all know we have these really huge, very costly brains that we take a long time to develop with an immense amount of parental investment. Maybe you have some experience with this. So you would expect that with that kind of massive investment in offspring, we would reproduce really slowly like elephants. But instead, we breed like rabbits. I mean, there's billions of us all over the world. So how can we actually afford this? I mean, if you look at it, humans have the longest development of any of the great apes. But human mothers have the shortest interbirth interval and the highest total fertility rate. That just, that doesn't make sense. It's a paradox. How can human mothers afford this? And so a lot of people have looked at this and said that the explanation has to do with a combination of factors, including cooperative breeding, the intergenerational transfer of resources, and the move to a more skill-intensive foraging strategy that emphasizes hard to get but high payoff game items. So basically what it is human mothers are able to afford to have more kids and invest more in them because they get subsidized by other members of the community. This is the mothers and others sort of argument. And the only way in which anybody else in the community has resources to help subsidize the reproduction of mothers is by producing some sort of surplus, which is achieved by what I would call technology. This is the intergenerational transmission of skills, techniques, and tools. So in essence, what this is describing is a basic human technological niche that has to do with the efficient transgenerational reproduction of foraging skills, a high degree of prosociality. What you see here in terms of, as an archaeologist, I might immediately focus on the materials that are being produced here, like tools and food items and fire. But of course, what we're also seeing is teaching and collaboration and pro-social interaction and sharing. And so that's really the niche that I'm talking about. It's a technological niche that has to do with production and reproduction and socially transmitted skill. And so the central thesis that I'm trying to develop here is that there might be a coherent underpinning to all of this, which has to do with the ability to efficiently learn and transfer skills. Right? So one important way which we learn and transfer skills is using language, which is, of course, also itself a skill that we learn. And that might sound, if you subscribe to the belief that a lot of language competence is genetically determined, sort of a Chomskyan view, it might sound a bit controversial to say that language is a skill. But even if you did believe that there was a lot of genetic component to language competence, it would still be clear that we have to learn how to actually produce language. I mean, you can think a comparison with walking, right? There couldn't be anything more innate than bipedal walking to humans, right? But you still have to invest time in learning it. as you're growing up, the performance. So as this is an article that was mentioned yesterday, and I don't want to focus on the why or wherefore of a memory constraint, but what they do point out is that the challenge in language performance and language comprehension is to deal with this very complex transient signal that's going by really fast, and you cannot hold all of it in your working memory and wait for the whole paragraph to go by before you figure out what I'm talking about. You have to very rapidly compress it. You have to assemble it into higher order chunks to summarize the basic gist of the meaning and forget a lot of the details. And in the same way, as I'm speaking now, I can't really be focused on the particulars of my articulation. I need to be thinking about this level of what I'm trying to say and very rapidly translating it into motor specifics. So I put this up here because I just love this quote. This is the point that I'm trying to make. So the ability to acquire and rapidly deploy a hierarchy of chunks at different linguistic scales is parallel to the ability to chunk sequences of motor movements, numbers, or chest positions. It is a skill built up by continual practice. So another key skill in the technological niche, transmission, is in fact theory of mind or mentalizing, being able to think about what other people are thinking. And again, there are certainly some innate elements to this, but Celia Hayes and Chris Frith have recently pointed out that, in fact, explicitly thinking in detail about what other people are thinking is a skill. And if you have kids, you also know that it's not necessarily easy for them to always think about other people. You have to sort of help them learn how to do that. And as they say, the acquisition of explicit mind reading as a slow, effortful process in which a novice develops an important culture-specific skill through expert tuition. This is facilitating by directing the novice's attention to signals. And interestingly enough, theory of mind is thought to be important for language acquisition. Language may be important for theory of mind acquisition. As an archaeologist, I would also be pointing out that there's a material culture that aids in this process. But the point that the point that I'm trying to make is all of these sort of uniquely human things that we're really fascinated by, like theory of mind and language and so forth, come together in this context of technological reproduction, which supports our basic reproductive strategy as a species. So this is very interesting. You get everything from individual perceptual motor learning abilities, hierarchical sequence processing, the self-control needed for extended practice. At some point in our evolution, we began really facilitating this skill acquisition process in others through things like collaborative action, the theory of mind that I was talking about, intentional communication and teaching, using things like ostensive gestures, intentional demonstration, scaffolding the learning process. So if we want to understand human uniqueness, we'd really like to know about this context. So how can we learn about it? And I think, yesterday brought into stark relief that a comparative approach is really, really important. We can learn a lot by looking at other species, but there are limits. If we want to know about the details of context and timing for changes that occurred since the last common ancestor with chimpanzees, for instance, we have to turn to the archaeological record to fill in those details. And there's a lot of kinds of things that we could theoretically look at, many Paleolithic skills, from butchery, making symbolic objects, fire, and so forth. I focus on stone tools because, due to just the sheer nature of preservation, this is what we have the best, most complete record of. So we'd like to really understand what it can tell us. But of course, the problem that we face is that these stone tools really don't speak for themselves. Okay, we went at great effort and expense and whatever and dug up all of these tools in Ethiopia, 2.5 million years old. You tell me what they tell you about cognitive brain evolution. These lumps of rock. Okay, so one of the ways that we can try to start getting information out of these things is to do experiments or to try making them ourselves to understand some of the processes that might be involved. So we do replication. And this, to make it sound more fancy, we call this experimental archaeology. It's a well-established method. You can think of it as similar to what forensic scientists might do if they wanted to study the effect of particular kinds of weapons. What wounds do they leave on cadavers and that sort of thing. Well, what we do is we study different production techniques. For instance, using an antler hammer and a prepared platform when you're making a hand axe leaves these characteristic microchipping along the platforms of the flakes, or you can build a giant pneumatic apparatus to study the fracture mechanical principles that relate the structure and shape of the rock to the morphology of the flakes that come off. And so we build up our interpretive models. So basically what experimental archaeology is about is these interpretive models. We start off usually with some kind of intuition. I'm pretty much aware that a scatter of broken rock like this is what you leave behind when you make stone tools. OK, but maybe I want to know a little bit more about this behavior. Like, did they use a hard rock percussor, or did they use an antler baton? So then I do an experiment using these two different kinds of methods. And I look for, are there any reliable material correlates of these two different behaviors? For instance, find details about the structure of the striking platform and the shape of the flakes and so forth. And hopefully there are. Then I feed that back into the interpretive model, and around we go again, finding out more about the past. So for better or worse, what's different about my research program is it's straight up experimental archaeology, but we introduce some additional data collection methods for describing the behaviors that we're interested in. So for instance, we can actually get at the brain physiological responses associated with particular behaviors using functional imaging techniques you may be familiar with, like FDG PET and fMRI. Probably everybody knows what fMRI is. FDG PET involves the use of a radiological tracer, so you can actually perform a behavior outside of the scanner and then collect data afterwards, so you can do more naturalistic things. We can look at differences in brain structure using structural scanning techniques like voxel-based morphology and diffusion tensor imaging. This is one that I'll be talking about a bit, which allows us to image changes in white matter structure associated with tool-making practice. And then there are various ways we can describe in more detail the actual physical activities. So this, I've kind of been, sorry, getting a little bit ahead of myself. One of the key limitations of any experimental archaeology is that you have to use a modern situation, and in our case, modern human individuals, to model the past. And of course, we don't want to assume that they're identical to our ancestors. So we always have to frame our interpretations with respect to the comparative evidence of differences in behavior and neuroanatomy in other species. And I hope to give you an example of that. The other point that now I remember I wanted to make here is that, of course, this involves a lot of different skills and techniques. I don't have all these skills, so I've been very fortunate to work with experts in these different techniques. Thierry Chaminade, Jihao Li, Aaron Hecht, and Aldo Feisel were all involved in the research that I'm going to present here. All right, so we've been doing this kind of, I kind of got coerced into calling it neuroarchaeology. I don't know if I like that phrase, but that's what we call it. And we've been doing this for something like 15 years now, so we actually do have some results. As I mentioned, we've used functional imaging techniques like FDG PET and fMRI, and these are indicated by the dots. We've looked at different tool-making techniques or technologies across various levels of experience, and all these dots indicate the activation foci, and you can see a clear pattern developing. The DTI gives us indications of where white matter changes have occurred in our subjects when we train them in different stone tool-making techniques. So these colored blobs indicate the white matter tracts and the connections that are actually plastically remodeled by stone tool-making training. Right, so you see that the dots and the blobs indicate a pretty consistent pattern across all of our studies, that there's this sort of dorsal, what we call a perception for action system that's consistently activated in stone tool making. And basically, in broad terms in the brain, people talk about two streams of processing: a dorsal one that I've just been showing you that involves visual information that's integrated with somatosensory information in the parietal lobe, used to infer information about spatial relationships and represent the body and its capacities for action to inform action planning. And a ventral root that is more sort of, we might think of it as a semantic root involved in object recognition. Right? And so this dorsal root is the one that is consistently involved in our tool-making paradigms. So this is good because this is actually a very ancient action system in the brain. So we don't have any reason to think that our ancestors had a wildly different brain organization and that our results with modern humans are not relevant. In fact, a very similar system is involved when, for instance, Atsushi Riki's group has trained monkeys to use tools, and you get responses in this same sort of ancestral primitive system. But of course, what we're really interested in human evolution is how this system may have changed through time. So it's conserved but modified, and work by Guy Orban's group has pinpointed some ways in which this system has actually changed in humans, including increased sensitivity in the interparietal sulcus to things like extracting hues of object form from 3D relative motion, and also an area in the anterior interparietal sulcus that's particularly responsive to handheld tools. And these areas are responsive in humans, but not in monkeys. They appear to be newly evolved. They are areas that are implicated in our studies of stone tool making. At Emory, some of my colleagues have also looked at the brain structural changes comparatively. And once again, if you look across macaques, chimpanzees, and humans, you see that there's this ancient ventral system that's pretty much conserved. It's already well established in monkeys, very similar. But what really has changed are these connections in the dorsal pathway that I'm talking about that have to do with coordinating perception and motor control for complex actions like tool making. Of course, the argument in this paper has to do with the well-known fact or the idea that this system for controlling actions is also what we use to perceive actions. That is, that we understand and imitate actions through a kind of internal simulation using the same perceptual motor systems that we use to execute the actions. And so the argument made in this paper is that elaborations in the connectivity of this dorsal root underlie our ability to have higher fidelity copying of actions. That is, that these connections between kinematics and spatial attention and goals allow us to actually imitate the details of actions in a way that's more challenging for monkeys and chimpanzees. And of course, as you're all thinking from yesterday, this is a very big deal because a lot of people think that what really has made the big difference in human evolution has this capacity for cumulative culture depending upon high-fidelity imitation, which may, in fact, be supported by some of these neuroanatomical changes, in particular in the dorsal stream. Right? So what can we learn about imitation in the past from the archaeological record? And maybe this is a little bit of an aside, but I wanted to tell you about some work that we have actually under review right now. So I work with the Gona project in Ethiopia. It's directed by Dr. Seleshi Sema. And this is a project which has the oldest evidence of Oldowan tools in the world at 2.5 million years. These used to be the oldest stone tools in the world. Now there's been an earlier, simpler kind of technology. They're called the Colloquium that's been described, maybe at 3.3. But this is the earliest Oldowan. And we've published evidence of 3 archaeological sites, all within a couple kilometers of each other, that represent the earliest Oldowan at 2.5 million years. And one of the interesting things about these 3 sites is there's a couple different methods used to make the stone tools at these sites. And in these 2 sites, they used one method. At this site, they used a different method. So I know what you're thinking, comparison, what could count for these difference in methods? Is this culture? Is this imitation? So if you know anything about Oldowan technology, you know that it's very simple. It basically involves taking a rock, hitting it with another rock, and knocking off a sharp-edged flake that you could use as a kind of knife. But despite it being so simple, if you spend way too long staring at these rocks, like we as archaeologists do, you realize that there's more than one way you could do this. And in fact, at least in theory, there's a bunch of different ways you could pattern the removal of flakes that come off of these cores that are schematically illustrated here. You could always hit it in one direction. You could hit it every which way. You could alternate. You could do centripetal. So these are all theoretical possibilities. Interestingly enough, we actually see these differences in the archaeological sites. So up here, this technique is almost universally used at the 2 EG sites. Whereas this bifacial and multidirectional stuff is pretty much what they do all the time at the OGS site. These are some actual illustrations of cores from EG and OGS, and maybe you can see all the flake stars going in the same way, all of them going in different directions. When you nap like this, when you make flakes like this, you're always hitting the exterior surface of the core. So what we call the striking platform has cortex preserved on it. When you're rotating around and hitting flakes, you're often hitting previous flake scars, so the cortex is gone. And these flakes then tend to not have cortex on their striking surfaces, right? And so in case, that just looks like a bunch of arrows and stuff to you, you can quantify this, and it's very clear that at the 2 EG sites, the cores show this one-directional pattern, whereas at OGS, they show the bi- and multifacial pattern. And when you look at the distribution of the cortex that I was talking about on the flakes, at OGS 7, they have no cortex, and at EG, they have cortex. So it's clearly unifacial and bi versus multifacial methods. So, this might sound to you like pretty good evidence of 2 different methods being used, and therefore kind of a technological tradition, based on pretty specific imitation of the exact way in which you're making stone tools, but we have to be careful, of course, about making claims about imitation. So the possibility is that, in fact, maybe there's something subtle about the differences in the raw materials at the two sites that just means it makes sense to do it one way at one site and another way at a different site. So maybe this is actually a natural convergence point for independent learning, and it's just guided by differences in the raw materials that are available. So we wanted to see whether, in fact, that is the case. So we did a bunch of experiments, reduced 40 cobbles using the two different methods. We had to sample all sorts of variation in cobble shape and composition and so forth. And I did two straight days of just napping flakes to create our sample. And we managed to pretty well reconstruct or replicate the archaeological sample. This is the experiment versus the excavated for the two methods. And they look pretty simple. Maybe if you, similar. Maybe if you're not an archaeologist, it's just like a bunch of rocks. So you'll be relieved. You can also quantify this sort of thing. So this is a measure of the number of flakes that have been removed, estimated. This is a measure just of size of the cores. And you can see in both of these cases, the experiments accurately reproduce the differences between the two archaeological sites. So the pattern is the same. You can also look not just at the cores, but the flakes that came off. Here is the whole flakes and the various types of fragments that are produced when you bash rocks together. And there are two important things here. The one is you see that in every case, the pattern of difference between the two sites is the same as the pattern of difference between the two experimental samples. So we're replicating the differences between these methods. And sort of the exception that proves the rule is that you see you have this large number of fragments here in the excavated sample and not in the experiment. And this is because these things have been in the ground for 2.5 million years. And they're not perfect. They're really nice, but they're not perfectly preserved. And so they've fragmented a bit in the ground. But the important thing is this appears to be a uniform effect. So it's not specifically biased any representation of one particular type, right? So it had an equal effect on all these different types. So we think the experimental model is a pretty good one for the archaeology. And I won't bore you with every different possible thing that we looked at about these different cobbles. We could not find any situation in which this particular unifacial technique was advantageous, right? So there's no reason to suppose that individuals would independently converge on this solution, no matter what kind of variation you had in the raw materials. And in fact, what I was just showing you, maybe you didn't quite notice, I didn't point out, the unifacial technique also produces a higher rate of fragmentation, and fragments are in general of lower utility than whole flakes. So in fact, unifacial flaking is kind of inefficient. So really, the bottom line is maybe a simple one. We conclude that there's really no way you can get independent convergence on these differences. So the only parsimonious and reasonable way to explain these differences between sites is, in fact, that they are specifically learning from each other and imitating details of action. All right, so returning to the brain then, what is the account of how you do this? How do you imitate action details? And as I mentioned before, the prevailing view for a lot of this is what we call the mirror system account. The idea that if I want to imitate your action, basically I'm going to internally simulate it. I'm going to recognize your actions and say, like, well, if I reached for a cup like that, I would be wanting to pick it up and drink it. I infer that that's what you're trying to do. An alternative method would be I see the cup and I see you, and I have semantic knowledge about cups, and I do sort of a logical inference that you probably want to drink it because I know you like to drink coffee and cups have coffee and so forth. But this is the simulation account. And this is the way a lot of people think that not only we understand what other individuals are doing, but that this is how we then imitate it. But I think that this account is limited. It's incomplete because the point is to learn through imitation things that we don't already know how to do. And the simulation matching account requires that you already have the internal models to match it with. Right? So if I'd never done this before and I saw you do it, I could probably imitate it pretty well because it involves a lot of familiar actions, and little details in exactly how you do it probably don't matter too much. So I could watch you do this once and probably effectively imitate it based on matching with things that I already know how to do. If I watched you do this once, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that, right? Because I don't have the internal models, and the details of action really matter. So I think that this is really important because the things that we're interested in are a lot more like this than they are like the simple tasks that you might learn. We're talking about complex embodied skills, right? So For instance, if I were to watch a pro pitcher and then try to do what he did, I wouldn't even notice these things if there weren't labels on it. When I watch this, it would all blur past me. I don't even know what to attend to. So the actual process of skill learning has to be this sort of spiral process between watching, hopefully being also coached, having somebody point things out to you, then practicing to build increasingly accurate internal models, and you get better and better at matching what you see. You perceive more, you match that, and so forth. And so cognitively, this is again that process of chunking, where we have to not only be able to see actions and then assemble them into complex coordinated actions, but we also have to take these chunks and fractionate them into specific details, because ultimately your success may depend at this very low level of motor organization. So we have to be able to take chunks apart and put them back together again. And this is the process of skill acquisition. And I think that this is the kind of underlying, perhaps key cognitive capacity underwriting human skill acquisition in this technological niche and so forth. So I've been talking a bit about stone tool making. Maybe it's helpful for you to actually see it. So this is Bruce Bradley, and this is just old one style flake production. And what I want you to attend to is, there's not much of a relationship between each individual flake removal. So he takes off a flake, and it comes off, and then he's going to just look around for another place that might be suitable. There's no sort of chaining of the actions in that sense. But what is going on is very fast, accurate percussive movements and a lot of really complicated manipulation. And what you probably don't appreciate is the importance of the bracing and the positioning of the fingers, like directly under the impact to absorb some of the force, and the precise positioning, the angle at which the core is positioned in his hand. And all those are things that you have to effortfully learn to do. And generally, when we try to teach people how to do this, they're almost universally surprised at how hard it is to do. And you can actually empirically look to see what makes this hard to do, as Blondie and Brill's group has done. They ask people to take a Sharpie and make predictions on a core as to what's going to happen when they hit it. And then they actually hit it, and you can measure the difference between their prediction and what they actually achieve. And what you find is only in highly experienced individuals is there any relationship between their prediction and what actually happens. Why is this? Well, one thing, they just miss. You don't hit what you're aiming for, you're not going to be able to predict the outcome. Another thing is that they don't adjust their kinematic force appropriately to the flake removal that they intend. Generally, novices tend to overcompensate by hitting things way too hard, and only the experts adjust. And so this kind of detailed physical competence, this embodiment, we can actually see in patterns of brain activation associated with the acquisition of skills, and particularly this dorsal pathway and the inferior parietal that we've argued is related to representing the bodily affordances and the tool body system. And in experts, this is more highly activated because they've acquired these actual skills. And so this might make an argument for how we can look at the archaeological record, we can look at the comparative evidence of brains, and maybe start to draw a correspondence between the demands of tool making and some of the specific anatomical changes that have happened over human evolution. But the point that I want to return to is that acquiring these skills takes time and effort and sustained attention, and it may also be scaffolded by social situations. So this sort of context of learning is the basis for some more particular proposals about the relationship between toolmaking and language. One of them you could call the technological pedagogy hypothesis. Is an old idea that we kind of summarized a little bit in 2012, just saying that this context of teaching could have provided the context in which you have selection for intentional vocal communication in language. I think you can find examples of this maybe going back to the 19th century. The development of labor brings members of society closer together, mutual support, joint activity, and finally they had something to say to each other, which I know for the 19th century wording is pretty reasonable. But there's been a lot of skepticism about this idea, and a lot of it relates to the proposal that in fact when you're learning craft skills, it's easier to just demonstrate or even just to watch somebody do something than it is for me to verbally explain how do you use a screwdriver, right? So there's been kickback in the idea, well, language actually isn't that important for transferring skills. So fortunately, there is some empirical evidence along these lines now, specifically with stone tool making, showing that in fact there is a transmission advantage, if you can talk. Right? So again, this, to non-scientists, this might seem rather an obvious point, that it helps if you want to teach somebody, if you can talk to them. But we're scientists, so obvious isn't good enough. So there's now some evidence that in fact, there's an advantage to being able to talk while you're teaching others to make stone tools. I have an example of what this looks like in a traditional context from New Guinea. This is a novice toolmaker sitting together with a bunch of experts, learning how to make a stone adze. And you can see he's, not exactly fluent in his actions. You hear all the other guys talking. It's a very social context. And now they can't resist, getting involved. Right. So, maybe not essential. Maybe you could figure this out on your own, but there's clearly an advantage, and that's what you need for an evolutionary argument, right? So the other possibility that I'll develop in the rest of my talk is this idea of exaptation that we've already heard of. And this is the idea that there's some very general capacities, for instance, for hierarchical sequencing, that are selected for perhaps in the context of skill learning, but then can be generalized to other behavioral realms, can be evolutionarily co-opted to support things like language. And again, this is something people have been talking about for a very long time, but I think there's maybe more evidence of it now. So we heard the term exaptation. This comes from Gould and Verba. And maybe the classic example is feathers, which maybe originally were used for display or thermoregulation or something like that, became exapted for flight. But the important point that I want to make here is that that's not the end of the story, because Gould and Verba stress that exaptation is a change in behavior, but then you get this new behavior, you get secondary adaptation. So there's clearly a big difference between the feathers here and the feathers there. And after you have the behavior entering the population, then you have selection acting on it to make it better. And so we actually suggested something along these lines for the relationship between toolmaking and language. We proposed that human frontoparietal circuits underwent adaptations for Paleolithic toolmaking that were behaviorally co-opted to support proto-linguistic communication and then subsequently altered by secondary adaptations specific to language, and I would say especially in the left hemisphere, right? We do have these dedicated language circuits and relatively fluent behavior. So the case for this in terms of archaeology is better supported for a more complicated form of stone toolmaking that emerged after 700,000 years ago and became really, really refined after 500,000 years ago, which is making these Acheulean hand axes. So what's complicated about these is you're not just trying to knock flakes off, you're actually trying to impose a shape on the core, and that's not easy to do with rock. In fact, one of the big tricks is to take a piece that's relatively thick in cross-section and make it thin. Because in order to thin the middle of the piece, you can only strike it at the edge. You have to strike these flakes that go more than halfway across the surface of the piece. And that's not easy to do in a controlled way. And in order to do that, you have to do things like carefully adjusting the morphology of the edge you're going to strike a flake from before you do, in order to get it into the right configuration to generate this flake. So in other words, I'm describing a long-distance dependency between one action and a later action that's going to happen. So again, it would be helpful for you to actually see this. This is the same demonstrator, Bruce Bradley, starting to make a hand axe. Already you can see that there's this pause for some planning beforehand, evaluation of the core and its potentials for action, testing some pieces, removing a little bit from the back. But now what he's going to do is this edge isn't at the angle that he wants it to be, right? So these flakes that he's striking now are not really the objective. The objective is to change the angle of this edge relative to this concentration of mass on the back to bring it up so that he can shoot flakes into the center of the core. And so he's now prepared this whole surface through here, and now he's going to strike a flake that achieves the goal that he wants, which was to invade into the middle. Right? And so all of this is the same thing. He's working this little, these little things, they're not doing much that you can see, but they're actually changing the fine structure of the area that he's going to hit, the platform, to ensure that then when he does do that, it has the effect that he intended. Right? So he's setting things up and then realizing them. And he's created a nice isolated platform here, which is going to allow him to strike these long flakes that go in. So another thing that you typically do is a sort of back and forth bifacial flaking to establish an acute angle all the way around. And that's particularly difficult in these areas that have a very thick butt to them and a very obtuse angles, right? So he's been doing a lot to just establish these edges here to where he can now actually remove the flake that he wants, and they see how long and thin and invasive that flake is. Here he is noticing an area that's problematic, in part because it has this white cortex remaining on it, which is soft and hard to hit, and also because the angles are wrong. So you can see he's puzzling over it. And what he's going to do is he's going to take a step back, go back to another part of the core that has angles he can work with, and then work his way in to establish a little platform where he can now get purchase to where he couldn't work before and start removing the flakes that he wants to do. And so I basically, time lapses. This took about 12 minutes for him to do, and I hope that you can see the complexity of the actions, right? And so, the idea is you can actually diagram this. If we take individual actions and we make a string out of them, you can see that sometimes you remove a flake here in order to achieve a goal here, whereas in the old one you have a very flat sort of just repetition of the same thing over and over again. So the prediction here is then we would expect this to be associated with parts of the brain that do this hierarchical information processing. The big one that everybody focuses on, inferior frontal gyrus, Broca's area bilaterally in the left and the right, seems to be involved in action chunking. So the prediction was that we should then see more of this in Acheulean flaking. In fact, we do, not only during action execution, but now in a larger sample during action observation, using an entirely different imaging modality. And we also know that when you train people to make hand axes, you get plastic changes in the white matter structure connecting to this same area. So we're getting a lot of converging evidence that this is important for tool making. The plasticity part is particularly important to me because I think we're getting closer to possible evolutionary mechanisms. As we heard from Andy last night, people are very interested in plasticity as being kind of the leading edge of adaptation. It allows you to explore new possibilities for action, which then can be subjected to selection. So there's actually two different versions of this. One is the sort of the Baldwinian idea that I just talked about. So if you have bears that walk bipedally for long enough, their pelvis and spinal cord is plastic enough to adapt to this, and you will get anatomical changes. But if they kept doing this for generations, some of those changes might become automatic parts of development and be genetically assimilated. An alternative is that the plasticity is so good that you never get rid of it. And in fact, this has been proposed for human brains to say that they're just built now to be more plastic, right? Either way, you would expect an association between changes we see in phylogeny, evolutionarily, and the focus of anatomical changes that we see in response to tool-making training. So to test this, we actually did a comparison of chimpanzees and humans in the relative fiber tract, and we found that the foci of evolutionary change, that's the increased connectivity to IFG, particularly in the right hemisphere, lined up very well with the effects of our tool-making training, right? So this is the last point. So that was a very interesting finding based on a relatively short, small sample of I think it was 7 individuals over the course of 18 months. So it has some limitations. So what we're doing now is we just finished data collection on a more extended project. It involves actually 20 subjects plus a 20-subject control group for 100 hours of standardized training on one technology with more refined skill assessments and more extensive artifact analysis. And in our larger sample, I'm happy to report that we've replicated this effect in SLF3 of training, and it's more extensive in our larger sample. We can see it better. We're also doing skill assessments. It may surprise you if you're not an archaeologist to know that there's no simple established way of quantifying your tool-making skill. So what we did was we have a consistent rubric of evaluation that then is transferred into a 10-point scale. But this is still subjective. A 10-point scale is not very precise, and it involves observations that we can't do in the archaeological record. So we wanted to turn this into something that we can get directly from the artifacts. So we measured a whole bunch of stuff about the artifacts, and following a method very similar to what Morgan did, we try to approximate the rating score with a specific model that combines some of these measurements, and we've gotten pretty good. So now we can use this objective model score to estimate skill. This allowed us, among other things, to rediscover something that we've known for 90 years, the power law of practice. You see that there's a tendency for a relatively rapid increase at first, and then it tails off. And what I want to draw your attention to, there's a lot of outliers here because during learning, performance is erratic. This has been observed before in studies of tool-making learning. So in order to get around this, we can actually derive learning curves for our individual subjects, and then we can use these interpolated values rather than the actual data points to get something more consistent. And if we do that, we see that, in fact, your skill at making a stone tool initially before any training is predicted by a measurement of white matter integrity in this very area, the inferior frontal gyrus. There's also a relationship after training. But what we're really interested in is whether the training, these change over time is actually predicted by anatomy. So if you take into account the initial variation and you parcel out the initial variation in aptitude, yes, there is a relationship. So white matter changes are predictive of actual skill learning in stone tool making in this region of inferior frontal gyrus. So I'll just finish with this. This is what we conclude. Stone tool making elicits both activity and anatomical remodeling in dorsal stream frontoparietal networks. These responses in individuals parallel evolved differences in brain anatomy between species. The white matter variation within and across individuals predicts aptitude and learning. And then in red, the speculation. Thus, selection on tool making ability and/or similar skills could have contributed to the evolution of frontoparietal networks, which now support distinctive human capacities for social learning, tool use, and communication, including language. So, thank you very much.